Have you ever felt the weight of someone quietly hoping you fail? Not openly, not dramatically, but subtly. In the way they downplay your success, in how they lean in when you're struggling, in the flicker of satisfaction behind their eyes when your voice shakes. It's not something you can easily name or prove, but you feel it. In your gut, in your chest. In the pause before you speak, knowing they're listening not to understand you, but to find the cracks. Some people don't want to see you rise. Your growth challenges the version of themselves they're unwilling to confront. So they would rather see you fall just to feel taller in the rubble. The truth is unsettling. There are people who thrive off your weakness, not because they're inherently evil, but because they've never known what real strength feels like without domination. There are people who can't clap for you because they've only ever measured their worth in comparison to others. Your success? A threat. Your confidence? A reminder. Your peace? An offense. And so they chip away, slowly, subtly, with questions masked as concern, with jokes that don't quite feel like jokes, with silence that echoes louder than any insult. You begin to wonder if you're imagining it. You start doubting yourself, adjusting your light, shrinking in spaces where you once stood tall. You silence your excitement, dilute your voice, second, guess your own wins. Not because you're unsure, but because their energy makes you question whether being fully you is somehow too much. But what if the truth is that your power has always been the very thing they feared? Not everyone is meant to celebrate your victories. Some are only comfortable when you're uncertain, because in your uncertainty they feel secure. In your doubt, they feel in control. And in your silence, they can project whatever story they want onto your life. They can frame your boundaries as coldness. They can rebrand your healing as selfishness. They can twist your growth into arrogance, all because it doesn't fit the version of you that made them comfortable. When you no longer bend, they call it rebellion. When you no longer explain, they call it rude. But the truth is they were only ever close to the version of you that was easy to manipulate. It's painful to admit that some people in your life never loved the real you. They loved the broken parts they could manage. They loved your wounds because they didn't threaten their ego. They loved your chaos because it distracted from their own. But when you start putting yourself back together, when your joy becomes intentional, when your presence no longer centers their needs, the illusion breaks. Suddenly you're not who they thought you were. Suddenly you're not as easy to guilt, to control, to guilt, trip into staying small. And that's when their true colors emerge. Not in confrontation, but in withdrawal, in coldness, in the slow fade, in the quiet resentment of watching you stand without needing their crutch. Ask yourself why your peace disturbs certain people, why your happiness triggers side comments, why your choices are met with raised eyebrows. It's not because you're wrong. It's because you've stepped out of the role they cast you in, and now they don't know what to do with you. The problem isn't that you've changed. The problem is they expected you to stay broken for their comfort, and every time you rise, it reminds them of the work they haven't done. Every time you choose yourself, it exposes their avoidance. You becoming whole is not just a personal act, it's a disruption. To systems, to dynamics, to illusions they depended on to feel powerful. So don't be surprised when they want you weak. Don't be shocked when they try to reel you back into old patterns, old guilt, old silence. Toxic people don't just appear in our lives as villains. Often, they come disguised as loved ones, mentors, friends, even partners who say all the right things while draining you slowly from the inside out. The conflict isn't always loud. It's insidious. It's in the way they create invisible rules you must follow to stay in their favor. It's in how your emotional independence becomes a silent threat to their dominance. At the surface, the relationship might seem functional, but underneath, it operates on an unspoken agreement they are in control as long as you stay unsure of yourself. When you begin to question that, the dynamic begins to unravel. This isn't always because they're aware of what they're doing. Sometimes they operate from a place of unhealed wounds, unresolved insecurities, and deep internal chaos that makes your stability feel like a personal attack. When someone depends on control to feel safe, another person's autonomy feels like abandonment. Emotional maturity, as Evy Poumpouras suggests, is not about managing others, it's about mastering yourself. But many toxic individuals were never taught that. They see the world through the lens of dominance and submission. In their world, relationships aren't built on mutual respect. They're built on leverage, on silent debts, on invisible strings. And once you start cutting those strings, you're no longer seen as loyal. You're seen as dangerous. Your clarity becomes rebellion. Your no becomes betrayal. Your silence becomes punishment. But none of it is about you. It's about their need to maintain control over the environment, over the narrative, and most of all, over you. The misconception is that toxic people are always overtly cruel, but some are deeply charming, strategic, even charismatic. They learn your emotional language, speak it fluently, and then use it as a weapon. They remember your childhood wounds and poke them when you resist. They study your soft spots and use them to keep you close. The moment you set boundaries, they remind you of your past mistakes. The moment you express needs, they accuse you of being too much. And slowly, you begin to wonder if you're asking for too much. You begin to shrink yourself to fit back into the space that makes them comfortable. That is the manipulation. It doesn't always feel like abuse. Sometimes it feels like confusion, guilt, obligation. And that's what makes it so hard to name. It's important to understand that toxic people often rely on your emotional intelligence to keep the cycle alive. They count on your empathy. They count on your desire to repair things. They know you'll reflect, question, take responsibility. And in that, they avoid doing the same. They avoid accountability by hiding behind your self-awareness. The more you try to understand them, the more they keep you spinning in cycles of over-explaining, overcompensating, and over-analyzing yourself. But emotional maturity isn't just about self-reflection. It's also about discernment. It's about knowing when a relationship requires effort and when it requires distance. Knowing when someone is growing and when someone is keeping you small because they refuse to. Philosophically, power is not always about force. It's often about perception. Toxic people distort your perception to convince you that your strength is a flaw, that your sensitivity is weakness, that your boundaries are selfish, that your independence is betrayal. They weaponize your virtues, so you start mistrusting the very things that make you whole. And as long as they can keep you doubting yourself, they don't have to confront their own emptiness. The deeper conflict is not between you and them. It's between your healing and their refusal to evolve. It's between your self-respect and their need to control. Once you see that clearly, you can stop trying to fix a dynamic that was only ever sustained by your silence. You can stop making excuses for people who only show up when you're broken. Because real love doesn't ask you to abandon yourself to stay connected. There comes a moment when the mask slips and the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Not because something big happened, but because something inside you finally clicked. It might start with a small interaction. A comment that stings deeper than it should, a pattern that keeps repeating, a weight that keeps pressing even in someone's absence. You begin to notice that every time you speak with them, you feel smaller afterward. Every time you share a win, there's a shadow cast over your joy. You begin to see how your light dims, not because it's fading, but because you've been shielding it for someone else's comfort. And when that realization hits, it doesn't feel like anger at first. It feels like grief. A grief for the time spent minimizing yourself. For the self-abandonment disguised as loyalty. For the way you twisted yourself into shapes that were never meant to hold your soul. You remember moments when you needed support the most and were met with silence, indifference, or worse, subtle delight. That quiet smirk, that veiled criticism, that backhanded encouragement all replay in your mind with new meaning. The words you once brushed off now feel like deliberate wounds. The laughter that followed your mistakes no longer sounds harmless. It was never just about misunderstanding. It was about control. The realization that someone who claimed to care was feeding off your weakness doesn't come like thunder. It comes like a whisper, and it rearranges everything. You begin to re-examine every moment you let your guard down, every time you apologized for simply being, every instance where you questioned yourself just to maintain the peace. This transformation isn't sudden, it's layered. There's the phase where you still seek their approval, even after knowing it won't come. There's the phase where you test the waters, sharing a little less, speaking a little softer, pulling back an inch to see how they react. And then there's the phase where silence becomes your answer, where you stop expecting anything, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. The craving for their validation dies a quiet death, and in its place, something new begins to grow. It's not pride. It's not ego. It's self-trust, a kind of internal steadiness that no longer needs to be explained. And that shift, that quiet recentering, is what truly disrupts them. Not the confrontation, not the arguments, but the absence of permission. You begin to see how much of their power depended on your participation. Your willingness to explain yourself, your desire to be understood, your hope that maybe one day they'd see the real you and choose to cherish it. But when that hope dissolves, so does the illusion. The connection doesn't feel sacred anymore, it feels strategic. You see how they needed you to be unsure so they could feel certain, how they needed you to feel indebted so they could feel generous. It was never about love, it was about leverage. And the moment you no longer trade your energy for crumbs of acceptance, their hold begins to crumble. There's also the guilt that comes with clarity. The moments you catch yourself missing them, even after everything, the part of you that still romanticizes the beginning, still wants to believe it was real. But nostalgia is not truth. Memory is not justification. You realize you were holding on to who they could have been, not who they truly were. And that's where emotional maturity deepens, not in forgiving them for their actions, but in forgiving yourself for not knowing better sooner, for staying when you didn't feel safe, for hoping when the evidence pointed elsewhere. This self-forgiveness becomes the foundation of your transformation. You begin to rewrite your story, not around what they did, but around what you've chosen since. You stop trying to prove your worth to people who never saw it, and instead, you start reclaiming it piece by piece. There is a stillness that comes after the storm, not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that feels sacred. It's the moment when the noise fades and you realize you're no longer chasing explanations. You're no longer trying to convince anyone of who you are. In that stillness, there is a reckoning, a return, a remembrance of the parts of you that were never broken, only buried beneath years of self-doubt and misplaced loyalty. You start to feel your own presence again, not as a reaction to others, but as a quiet, steady pulse that has been waiting for you to listen. And it is in that silence that you begin to rebuild, not with rage, not with revenge, but with reverence. Reverence for the strength that carried you through, even when you were too tired to see it. Reverence for the scars that tell the truth of where you've been and how deeply you've loved, even when it wasn't returned. The light you find in solitude is different from the light you seek from others. It doesn't flare up for applause or flicker for validation. It glows. It steadies. It warms the parts of you that no one else bothered to understand. You begin to realize that the love you were begging for from others is the love you were meant to give yourself. Not in a surface, level, performative way, but in a soul deep commitment to protect your peace, to honor your truth, to be loyal to your own becoming. It is not a lonely place, though it may feel unfamiliar. It is not a punishment. It is a return to your source, the place untouched by manipulation or projection. The place where your worth was never up for debate. In this inner sanctuary, you start to understand your scars differently, not as marks of damage, but as sacred etchings of experience. Each one tells a story, not of defeat, but of survival, of awakening, of boundaries learned through pain, of wisdom earned through heartbreak. And instead of hiding those scars, you begin to let them breathe. You begin to see the beauty in your resilience, not as a defense mechanism, but as a reflection of your truth. There is no need to perform strength anymore. It simply is. Quiet, unshakable, rooted in the soul. You've stopped flinching at your own reflection. You've stopped editing your truth to make others comfortable. And in doing so, you've become someone they can't figure out anymore. Not because you're hiding, but because you're no longer available for interpretation. The power in that is undeniable, not loud, but unignorable. People start to sense the difference. They can feel the shift in your energy, even if they can't name it. The same people who once fed on your doubt can no longer reach you in the same way. Their hooks don't catch. Their narratives don't land. Not because you've built walls, but because you've returned to your center. And from that place, you no longer need to defend your choices. You no longer internalize their projections. You let them have their stories, their assumptions, their discomfort, without making it your responsibility to soothe it. You are no longer here to play small so others can feel big. You are no longer here to apologize for existing in your fullness. You do not owe anyone a diluted version of your light. This clarity becomes your quiet rebellion. This peace becomes your form of resistance. And this love for your mind, your soul, your sacred self, becomes your revolution. You carry it in your walk, in your gaze, in your silence. You carry it not as armor, but as truth. Not as performance, but as presence. The world may not fully understand it. Some may resent it. Some may try to dismantle it, but they can't reach what you've reclaimed. They can't unsee what you've awakened to. They can't break what you've built from the inside out. Because this strength is not borrowed. It is not reactive. It is not conditional. It is yours. There is something quietly revolutionary about no longer needing to prove yourself. When you stop explaining your choices to people who never cared to understand you, when you stop chasing closure from those who only ever offered confusion, when you stop trying to shrink into the version of yourself that made others feel more comfortable, you start to taste a kind of freedom that cannot be taken away. Not because it was given to you, but because you claimed it. You begin to walk differently, not because life gets easier, but because you're no longer carrying the weight of everyone's expectations. You stop looking outward for affirmation and instead begin listening inward for direction. What once felt like abandonment now feels like alignment. What once felt like loss now feels like liberation, because you finally understand that the real revolution was never about changing them. It was about returning to yourself. Your healing confuses the people who benefited from your brokenness. Your peace unsettles those who relied on your chaos to feel stable. Your quiet confidence challenges those who needed your insecurity to feel powerful. But instead of shrinking back, you stand. Not defiantly, not with the need to prove anything, but with the kind of groundedness that comes from deep internal work. You stop reacting. You start choosing. You speak less and say more. You love yourself not through words, but through boundaries, through rest, through discernment. Through the decisions you make that reflect your worth, even when no one is watching, you are no longer interested in participating in dynamics that ask you to abandon yourself for the sake of harmony that was never real. What once triggered you now teaches you. The manipulation, the passive aggression, the gaslighting, it no longer draws you into war. You see it, you name it. You step back, not because you're cold, but because you've grown. You recognize that energy is currency, and you're done investing in bankrupt connections. You start to understand that silence is not weakness, it's wisdom. That detachment is not indifference, it's clarity. That peace is not passivity, it's power. You are no longer baited by drama disguised as urgency. You are no longer seduced by attention that only shows up when you're useful. You are no longer flattered by those who applaud you only when you're broken enough to be managed. And in this quiet reclaiming of your space, something inside you becomes unshakable. You realize you don't need to explain your glow to those who preferred you dim. You don't need to justify your growth to those who stopped evolving. You don't need to soften your truth to be digestible for people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You are not for everyone, and that is your power. You understand that the people who are meant to walk beside you will not be threatened by your healing. They will not punish you for your boundaries. They will not resent your joy. You are no longer interested in convincing anyone of your value. You embody it, you express it, you protect it, and in doing so, you become someone who lives rooted in self-trust, not in external permission. This is the quiet power of being unbeatable. Not because you've never been hurt, but because you've chosen not to stay broken. Not because you're perfect, but because you're present. Not because they changed, but because you did. You stopped asking for room and built your own table. You stopped trying to fit in and started showing up. You stopped performing your pain for applause and began honoring your healing in silence. And now, there is nothing left to prove, nothing left to defend, nothing left to chase. There is only the truth you've fought for, the peace you've created, and the self you've finally come home to